I have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker today, who's Jody Fernando, and she'll be giving a wonderful presentation that you can watch again later. It's being recorded. I have a feeling it will be that good. So a few things about Jody. Mostly I just picked my favorite things about Jody that I know, and I'm sure she'll be sharing some others. One, she's bilingual. She speaks Spanish fluently and English, and she was a Spanish teacher at different points in her career, which I don't know what will come up in the presentation. Maybe that'll be mentioned. She's also an expert in educational technology and has a master's in that even. And I'm always learning from her. She makes things look effortless that to me seem much more challenging. She's a gifted writer. So she was helping direct the writing center here at APU at one point. And she's written a book, which I happen to have here, called Pondering Privilege. I think it would be a book that all of you would enjoy. If you'd like to look at my copy later, you can, and then maybe you can talk to her about how to buy it. So she has had director roles. She directed the TESOL programs at Taylor University, which is in Indiana. As I already mentioned, she was directing the Writing Center here at APU, and she's currently directing the English Language Learners program at Mount San Antonio College, which is just down the road in Walnut. So let's welcome her warmly and enjoy what she has to share.
I'm delighted to be here with you today and happy to share some of my experience and lessons that I have learned over the course of my both personal and professional life. What I want to talk about today, and I'll give you a quick sneak preview where we're going to end up, is professional resilience. We live in a time, a pretty tumultuous time. We see headlines every day that challenge our heads and our hearts. We are professionally living through a lot of change in our field because of the global nature of our world. And that impacts who we are, what we do, how we work. So how I want to get to that point, though, is I want to share and elaborate a little bit on what Tasha told you quickly on my experience, so you can kind of see a picture of where I have been. For those of you who are students, what might my path look like? For those of you who have been practicing for a while, I'm guessing we might share some themes here, because English language teachers are adventurers, we're travelers, we're explorers, and that's a lot of the theme of my story as well. So we're going to start here and go through a quick little journey. I was born in the cornfields in Indiana, grew up there my whole entire life in a lily white town with no diversity at all, and yet deep within me was a love for cultures. My first best friend was Mexican. My second best friend moved from Sweden in third grade. She was an English language learner. We hosted an exchange student in high school, and I ended up hanging out with either the small handful of Mexican immigrants who lived in our town or the exchange students who had come to my high school, because this was something deeply ingrained in me, even though I had very little exposure to it. And so that led to some adventures and exploration of other parts of the world. I went to Mexico several times as a teenager, where I worked in orphanages, children's home. This is what started my love for Spanish. I say I learned Spanish simply because it was the first language I ran into. I love language, and I love children, and I love culture. And so it was natural for me to learn Spanish, and as a language teacher, easy for me to do that. And then I went back to Indiana after high school, did my bachelor's in Spanish education at Taylor University, a fellow Christian college, and graduated from there. While I was in college, I ended up heading with Youth for Christ to Burkina Faso in West Africa. This is a picture of my very first ESL classroom. These are not my students. It was raining this day, and my students did not come to class when it rained because they feared getting sick. At the time, Burkina Faso was one of the poorest countries in the world. My classroom had one light bulb that was above. If you have taught in developing world contexts, you may relate to this. One light bulb that I hot wired with 2 wires sticking out of the wall, and it would spark, and then the light bulb would turn on. Eventually, my students said, "Teacher, no, we turn the light on for you," because they were afraid I was going to kill myself by hot wiring my light bulb on. And yet these were kids who came because they were curious, because I was one of the only foreigners in their capital city of Ouagadougou who came, and so who they had ever seen. They would wave at me on the motorbike on the way to class. And so my students didn't come to class one night, and they came and they used my markers, stole all my marker caps from me, left the markers because I told them, give me the markers. I think they liked the colors because everything where I was in Ouagadougou was covered in red dust. And yet I learned here probably one of the fundamental lessons of my career. You don't need much to be a good teacher. It's nice to have supplies and resources and super helpful, and I much prefer that. But there's a lot you can do to educate people with very basic resources. So from Burkina Faso, I headed back. I graduated from college with a Spanish degree and got hired at an urban middle school in Indianapolis, Indiana, a historically black school, where it was probably 70% African American, 20% Latino, and 10% white, teaching Spanish downtown Indianapolis. In this context, at the public school, this was my first time ever, I'm from small town Indiana, teaching in an urban context with urban dynamics of high poverty situations and lifestyles. I often say my students taught me more than I taught them in these contexts, and I learned a great deal. And the book, Tasha mentioned a lot of this, my understanding of privilege and the privilege that I carry both on a race and an economic and an educational level. All of that comes back to all of these experiences, particularly my students here who were gracious teachers to me as I learned a different reality than what I had ever known about what it means to grow up in a different context than what my normal was. So from Indianapolis, I ended up in Thailand. Long story short, family friend who taught English there, and I did a tour of English. I was thinking maybe I'll teach English. Went to Thailand to tour English language teaching schools and just check out, is this something I want to do? The short answer was no, not so much. I enjoyed being in Thailand, obviously. It was interesting to learn about the field, but it wasn't necessarily an area that hit a chord for me. And yet it was interesting and helpful for me to learn about the field of EFL, watch her. She was teaching in a technical institute. She was Thai herself. Learn about cultural dynamics of Thai teachers and Western teachers and how that impacts educational systems. It also gave me an introduction to the world of East Asia because I happened to be dating a man from Sri Lanka at the time. And so both were Buddhist countries, started forming an understanding in me about Buddhism and Buddhist countries, the very different kinds of Buddhism between Thailand and Sri Lanka, so understanding nuance in cultures and religion and how that impacts even who my future students would be. Came back to Indiana and married the Sri Lankan that I was dating, and in Indiana, and we had been dating for 4 years in rural Indiana and decided that we'd had enough of the Midwest and moved to Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., I got a job in a suburban high school that was very different than the urban middle school where I had been teaching. This was also Spanish, teaching Spanish, but this was multiple, over 30 languages spoken in my school, lower middle income, so more suburban, lower middle class students. Parents often worked for government, things like this. totally new understanding. Again, thinking of the background I came from, which was very monocultural, broadening and broadening and broadening, and understanding of not everybody fits the box that I saw news media putting them in. And so again, these students became my teachers, understanding people as individuals, as well as how understanding of groups help us understand our students and the people around us and the situations that we teach. We love DC, but it's expensive, and we had a baby. And at the time, it wasn't something, I didn't think I could handle 130 high school students and my own children at the same time. I did not have enough energy for all of them. And so doors opened for us unexpectedly to return to Indiana, for my husband to be a professor back at Taylor University, where we started. This led to me teaching Spanish at the university, as well as founding their ESL teacher training program, because they were looking to do this. I had the background and some experience, and so I built their TESOL program from the ground up while we were there for 8 years. Unfortunately, living as an interracial family in rural Indiana, Taylor, is anybody familiar with Taylor? I'm curious. Mary knows a little. Tiny town of 2,000 people, one blinking yellow stoplight, one stop sign, and a really great ice cream shop of national renown. However, it is 20 minutes from the site of one of the most recent public lynchings in America, active KKK, very difficult. We were the only interracial family in town, and it made the 8 years that we lived there very, very long and hard. I say my most potent spiritual lessons from those years were perseverance, resilience, and speaking honestly, because they were hard years for us to live feeling very isolated, culturally, racially. And so after 8 years, the doors opened for us to come out here to California, sunny California, which growing up in Indiana, we thought was a different country, right? Which I'm sure some of you think the same thing about Indiana, so it's okay. And so when I moved here, I started teaching in the American Language and Culture Institute at APU, did that for a semester, and then ended up moving to Citrus College, teaching adult immigrants there in their ESL program. And as if you are employed in Southern California, this may ring a little bit true. There's a lot of part-time work, and so you take the work where it is, right? So from Citrus, I also at the same time taught here in the MA TESOL program. I know I have a couple students here, which was fun to kind of supplement and do a couple things at the same time. I really love teacher training. It's probably one of the favorite jobs that I have had. And so it was fun to return for me to that. However, the cost of living in Southern California, again, like Washington, D.C., is high, and full-time work for many of us is desirable, right? So I thought, well, I can teach public school. I'll go back to public school, even though it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And yet, with a Spanish education degree, you can walk in the door because there aren't a lot of certified Spanish teachers. So I did at a charter school that shall we say, had a lot of complications and chaos, and wasn't a great fit for me. And so from there, I quickly moved to Rancho Cucamonga High School in Chaffee Joint Union District. And in contrast, was the best school I've ever worked at, most innovative teachers I have ever seen. They use total physical response storytelling, if you're familiar with the methodology, as a curriculum and they had ditched textbooks completely. They had curriculum, just no textbooks, ditched textbooks, and picked up the methodology of comprehensible input and TPRS as their methodology. And so it was fascinating for me to enter a situation with very innovative and active and creative teachers, one of the most creative environments that I've ever worked in. However, the thing I will say about that, I loved my colleagues. I loved the administrators. Best public school I think I've ever seen. My problem was I spent all day with 135 14-year-olds, and after 10 years in higher ed, took a lot of energy for me. And what I realized was it was really hard for me to return to working with teenagers after I had developed a love for adults and college students, and adults and college students in general most of the time, with a couple little exceptions here and there, behave. Teenagers don't. And so it was a situation where I thought, I could make this work. I could do this. But a door opened, and a job as the director of the Writing Center here at APU opened up. And I am a writer, and I have administrative experience, and all the stars aligned, and it was a great fit. And so I thought, all right, obviously the public school door, we can close that. This is full-time work, I'll do that. In the midst of doing that, a job opened up at Mount Sac, where I currently am as the director of their non-credit ESL program. It wasn't a door that I necessarily intended to walk through, and yet an early philosophy my husband and I established in life was knock on open doors and walk through them if they opened. And this was one. I saw it and thought, ooh, that's my skill set, I think. And so I'm gonna knock and see, even though I wasn't real keen on moving or change, because obviously there'd been quite a bit of change, right? And so I knocked on the door, and it opened all the way to a job offer. And after praying about it and spending a lot of time reflecting, felt that, yes, this is the door that I should walk through. Mount San Antonio College ESL, if you don't know, is the largest single-site ESL program in the state of its kind. 4,000 students. We have 60 faculty. A couple of them are here. Very well-respected for what we do. Excellent teachers, high-quality ESL. And so I was very, very proud to join their staff and what they do because of the quality of ESL that they provide to the adult immigrant population. So really exciting, right? Get this job, definitely my skill set all the way, and very excited about it, except on days when it felt like this, or days when it started to feel like this, or maybe a few days like this, as any of you who have had new jobs know, right? They don't all go in a straight line, and you don't walk into any job with all of the knowledge or skill set that you need, which means steep learning curves and roller coastery days and challenging times where you may not know what to do. So at this point, does this sound familiar to anybody, right? And certainly not every detail, but this is a career in ESL for many of us. Obviously, I've moved a lot. Outside of the field, I don't find this as normal. People kind of look at me weird, like, you're from Indiana? You lived in Washington? What? And yet in the field, I can often make an assumption that people have lived in a variety of places. If they haven't lived in a variety of places, they've traveled to a variety of places. Change is a norm for us, and we're comfortable to an extent with it, right? So what I want to look at now, looking at the field and talking about our profession, thinking for those of you who are students, or maybe those of you who are seasoned professionals, going, either is this all there is, or do I really want to do this, or yeah, I love what I'm doing, but I'd like to do more. There's a variety of places we can sit at in our professional lives. So if we look at the field of TESOL, we've got a lot of different sectors that you can possibly work in. You can go the K-12 route, which I have. You can work in community colleges. In community colleges, you can do credit ESL, which is preparing international students. You can do non-credit ESL, which is adult education. You can work private companies or get your own contracts, ELS, some of the private language schools that offer short-term ESL programs. You can teach abroad with private companies. You can do teacher training. Often this requires a PhD, but not always, depending on the region of the country that you live in. And you can do teacher training with things like Oxford seminars, so it doesn't necessarily have to be at a university, though it can be. You can do curriculum writing for publishing companies. You can work with professional organizations, think tanks. I know the one think tank that I've been exposed to a lot because I was trained in Washington, D.C. in ESL was the National Capital Language Resource Center. Frequently worked with our public schools, and so they did a lot of research on English language education and foreign language education, which are pretty similar under the same umbrella, all the language ed. So think tanks, if you enjoy research, you can work with non-government organizations abroad. Mary does a lot of this, I believe. So she would be an expert resource on that, or working with government organizations, which you also have Mary as an expert in your midst on those areas of working there. Now, with different sectors, there's a lot of different roles that you can play as well. Obviously, the one we probably most frequently think of is teacher, right? When I came in, I did a master's in Washington, D.C. in multicultural, multilingual education. To be honest, I was 25 and I did it because I thought it sounded cool. I didn't even know it would train me to teach ESL. I didn't realize that that was part of it, where I was at in my professional life at the time. And I love the cultural piece of education. And I had the language from the Spanish ed piece. And so, but I knew I liked to teach, right? What I didn't know at that point was how many other things that teachers are skilled to do. Other roles you can move into administration, which I have. Administration looks different in different types of institutions. So one administrator at a private isn't equal to administrator at a public. There are some leadership skills that overlap, but the different institutions require different skill sets. You can work as a writer, curriculum writer. There's a thriving, obviously I'm sure many of you use it, business for online curriculum writing. People who are really good at it often sell their work on sites like Teachers Pay Teachers, or if they're really good, they get their own website and do training themselves, or provide curriculum themselves, write textbooks, things like this. You can work as a researcher, again, a trainer, or even if you love your setting and where you're at, you're well established, thinking in terms of how can I mentor newer teachers and help newer teachers learn the classroom. Classroom is a challenge for anybody walking into it for the first time, and our new teachers desperately need experienced and seasoned teachers to come alongside them and help them learn the field and how to be effective educators and not just people, oh, I like students, and learn, the trades and the tricks and the strategies of the classroom so that they too can become expert teachers. So on top of those roles, we have sectors, and we have different sectors we can work in. We have different roles we can play. Here in Southern California, since we're all here, ESL teachers have to contend with being freeway flyers. Often, many of my teachers teach from 8 to 1 in the morning at one institution, plan or grade in the afternoon, and drive to another institution in the evening. And so that's a reality of our field if you need to piece together full-time work. We've got we live in a highly regulated state. California has 500,000 educational codes for our educational system. 60,000 of those apply to community colleges. So if you work in publicly funded institutions, the Ed Code requires that we comply to law that is set by legislators who are not trained educators. So the law may or may not make sense according to what best practice for education is. Challenge. Sometimes it's helpful because funding comes with it, and funding doesn't necessarily create quality education, but it certainly helps, right? then we have the challenge of the almighty dollar. If you're working in private institutions who the dollar is the bottom line, or they're in it for the money, that creates different realities, right? Because again, it may not be best practices or good, solid, sound theory and pedagogy that drive the philosophy of the institution. It's the dollar, right? And then some of us are tired because we're getting a little old. Students, that's not you. And all of these things, when you're in education, I've been in education for 2 decades. When you're in education, you see the vocabulary and the ideas recycle about every decade. If it's a slow state, about every 15 years. If it's a fast state like California, maybe every 7 or 8 years. And good teaching is good teaching with new words attached, and sometimes new ideas that we learn from the research that informs what best practice is. It's certainly not same old all the time, but there are time-tested ideas in education that as teachers we know work across the span of time and cultures and students. So here's our question, right? We've got all of these realities. We live in times that can feel very hard. Sometimes, I said to somebody the other day, she said to me, I wasn't really serious when I said I was going to quit. And I said, that's okay. If you don't say you're going to quit 3 times a semester, you're not a real teacher. Because there are times that we are simply exasperated with our field. What we do is challenging and hard at sometimes. What we do is also incredibly rewarding and beautiful at other times. And so we live in this balance between the beautiful and the hard, and we need to know, how do we survive professionally in the mix of the world that we're entering, and how do we contribute in ways and lead in ways that move our field forward? So I've run into this great little word, big word, I should say, particularly this year, again, as walking through a new job that carries pretty significant leadership responsibility. But really, yes, it's been this year, but I can also very easily tell you this has been my whole career, is learning the idea of resilience, of the ability to bounce back when I feel stressed and pressured. I would advocate that a resilient attitude gives us the ability to lead through times of tumult and through times of change. And so what I want to spend the rest of our time talking about is, how do we do this? What does it look like to be professionally resilient? The Center for Creative Leadership has this great little summary of how can we be resilient? And I want to go through this and look at these steps. Quickly, I'll just read them to you so you have the overview. And then I want to go through them and apply them to the field of TESOL itself. So number 1, accept change. 2, be a continuous leader. 3, take charge. 4, find your sense of purpose. 5, pay attention to your self-identity. 6, cultivate relationships. 7, reflect. And 8, skills shift. Let's look at and break this down a little bit according to what we actually do. So 1, accept change. I love teachers. I am a teacher. I'll probably always see myself as teachers. So I say this to you with great love. Teachers can stink at accepting change, okay? It's hard. But I also will say, I think humans aren't very good at it. And so the fact that it's hard for teachers means we're human. And so when we run into times of change, it's hard. It can be very hard to face. Things like our teaching load can change. The leadership styles that we are under vary. If you get a new leader if you love an organization you're in and a new leader comes in with a different style, they may be very effective and competent, but it still brings stress and pressure. because it's different, right? Institutions, it's very different to work in a private versus work in a public. It's really different to work in a public community college versus a public four-year. It's very different to work in high school versus elementary school. So depending on the institution, there's always going to be a level of change. Our students might change, the cultures of our students might change, the educational backgrounds of our students, the attitudes of our students, the ages of our students. Are all variables within the classroom, and it's important that we know how to adapt to the differences that our students bring to the classroom inherently. Legal requirements. Several years ago, all the intensive English programs went through a shift when the government required accreditation, right? And so that's a change. For a while, we could do whatever we darn well pleased, and now we have to comply to something. Methodologies and pedagogies change. We've moved from all the way back in grammar translation to now we're looking at things like translanguaging and bringing in second language support or first language support to the classroom. And the value of that and what that means. And so being flexible in and open-minded to when change happens, how do I look at it and welcome it into my life as opposed to fight it? Some of the ways, I also think this happens on a professional level, but I would advocate that it also happens on a very personal level. And personally, if we're not comfortable with change and doing things to help facilitate and give us a personal ability to adapt to change, we won't be able to do it professionally. So some of the things I have found in my own life that help me accept change, spiritual disciplines, things like practicing contemplation, spending time in silence, centering prayer when things are really chaotic, which they are prone to be, right? Making sure I have space in my life, making sure there are friendships. I have friendships who I can talk about, I'm struggling with this change. I don't understand why X equals Y equals Z, whatever the details are. And then a comfort with ambiguity, that maybe we don't know the end, and that's okay. Putting ourselves out there and letting the chips fall as they may, even if we don't know where they will fall. The second one, becoming a continuous learner, learning new skills, gaining understanding, and applying them in times of change. I think teachers are great at this, some clearly better than others, but doing things like reading, always following what's the literature saying about the field right now, keeping up on research in my areas of interest, being active in professional organizations. California, we're super fortunate. TESOL is incredibly strong organization, great training conferences, both regionally and on a state level that don't require a lot of money to go to things like the international TESOL conferences. Take advantage of the regional trainings and professional development opportunities that TESOL offers because they allow you to do this, to be a continuous learner. If you are so prone and you enjoy it, do research. At Mount SAC, we sponsor teachers to do action research projects, and I love it when teachers do. Sometimes teachers get scared of it and think, ooh, research, that's not me, I just teach, right? And yet it's great, it informs them. Rita, who's here, has done quite a few action research projects for us, so she would be an expert on that to talk to. And if you enjoy curriculum writing, write. Look at who other writers are and put your information out there. One of our other teachers at Mount SAC is the newly incoming president of TESOL, and she's retiring. Yay, Susan Gare, will give her a shout out. She is the newly incoming president of TESOL, and as she retires, she's going to write curriculum just to get back to the field because she loves to write it and she's great at it. So, number 3, taking charge of your own career and your own development. Here I would say, as you work, if there are things that maybe you don't enjoy or that you don't understand, resist the urge to feel stuck and that whole change piece, oh, I don't want to change, and think, how can I take charge? If there's a piece I don't enjoy especially, What could I do to change that? And so do things, pursue new opportunities like additional training. Improve your technology skills. I do have a master's in educational technology, but I cannot emphasize, so I'm biased, but I can't emphasize enough how broad you will grow your skills if you can do technology. The opportunities available in online teaching, in online English teaching can supplement, if you're working part-time, they can help transition if you're in situations where if you're home with kids or between jobs. There's a lot of opportunity if you've got the tech skills to, again, add additional opportunities to your professional expertise, as well as in the classroom, right? So there are ways you can work from home, as well as ways you can bring technology into the classroom if you have those resources available where you teach. When I hire new teachers, I'm always looking for tech skills, and there are many times I don't hire if they don't have them. And so that would be one area I would strongly recommend. We live in a technological world. It's our fourth skill after literacy, or third, literacy, numeracy, and technology is what everyone needs to know. We all know how to read, write, and arithmetic, right? Tech is the one that we're adding. And then building your professional networks. Things like this are excellent to be at. Get to know people. I love coming to these kinds of events because they help me I've worked with Kevin before. I see people, and I love seeing all the faculty from APU. Hey, how are things in your field? What's going on? It keeps me informed. It keeps me alive. In our day-to-day lives, we can get bogged down with details of just what the daily working world is, right? And it helps when you build professional network to lift your head outside of your immediate picture to see the bigger world of what's happening. 4, finding your sense of purpose, helping you assess setbacks within the framework of a broader perspective. How many of you have seen Angela Duckworth's TED Talk or read her book on grit? Anybody? It's making the rounds right now. If you haven't, it's 6 minutes. I would highly recommend it. Grit is something that I think is very important that we bring to the table as professionals. What Angela Duckworth says, she started studying, she was an educator and then moved into psychology and wanted to know what makes people succeed besides talent and intelligence. And what she found is it's also hard work and the ability to do things that you don't like and to stick with it. And so she outlines these 4 ideas. If you're courageous, you're okay with failure. And I will tell you right now, sometimes you will fail. It might be a bad evaluation. It might be a job that feels like it's not a great fit for where you're at. It might be you just blow it in a teacher conference with a parent because you don't know what to say because you don't have the experience to have all the speeches in your back pocket, right? And you go home and you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. I'm not good, I can't do this, I'm gonna quit and leave forever and grow a garden and sit on the beach and be homeless and, whatever we tell ourselves, right? And yet grit is that ability to feel all of those things, right? Because stuffing them doesn't work either. And then to pick ourselves up and say, you know what, I'm gonna keep going, right? I'm gonna be courageous, I'm gonna be okay. Maybe I feel like a failure right now. It doesn't necessarily mean that I am. It's the ability to be conscientious and to think about what are my goals and how am I gonna achieve those goals? The world does not happen to me. I happen to the world, or however plucky and energetic we feel, that's excited, right? But however, if we see a goal and say, I want to do this, if we only have one goal and we can't achieve that one singular goal, and sometimes that pops our bubble and we quit. But if we can look in terms of an overarching purpose, which I'll talk about in a little bit, it helps us achieve bigger goals and be conscientious about what our bigger goals are and our long-term goals and follow through to our long-term goals, as well as focusing on excellence. I make a distinction here. Excellence is not being perfectionist. Perfectionism makes us paralyzed. It makes us unable to move forward. Working with excellence means we're okay with ambiguity. It means sometimes we don't know the answer, but we think of ways and find ways to find those answers. It means if somebody says, hey, do you want to participate in this initiative or this activity? Because they see something in you that they think you'd be good at this, you say, sure, I'd like to do that. Even if inside you feel like a bowl of Jell-O, right? That you're trying new things, pursuing new opportunities. Now, talking about purpose, one note I want to make that I have learned, and another life lesson that I've carried through, it comes from an idea from a book by Jan Johnson, who sometimes actually works with APU. She's a spiritual director from Simi Valley. Her book is called Living a Purposeful Life. And she talks about how when we establish a purpose, it's really important that our purpose, again, is not a singular goal. That our purpose can't just be, I want to teach English to low-income students in East LA. Because what happens if you move to Upland, Indiana, and there aren't any low-income Latino students there? Or as was told to me, I called around schools saying, hey, I just finished a degree in ESL, I can teach English as a second language. Do you have any students who might need help? And the principal responded and said, sorry, ma'am, we're 99.9% white here. And I went, what am I gonna do? Because I wanted to work with immigrants, and there were no immigrants where I was working. And what I learned at this time of my life was sometimes our purpose needs to be able to be applied wherever we are. And I learned this from Jan Johnson. And so I developed, over the course of a couple decades probably, purposes that I carry through every job that I have had, which at this point I can't keep track of, but caring for the tender-hearted. So when I'm teaching college freshmen are tender-hearted, right? They're away from home sometimes for the first time. They've lost their status as a senior down to the lowly freshman. Everything's new. They don't know what they're doing. They're exploring new ideas, having old paradigms challenged for the very first time. I can care for the tender-hearted as college freshmen. I can care when we moved to California and I got the job at Citrus. I will affirm that California at points can feel like a new country if you're coming from the Midwest. We see this in the news all the time. It's no secret that the cultures are very different. And yet, teaching the adult immigrants at Citrus College, they were tender-hearted. I had a lot of refugees from Syria, asylees from Egypt and China, and they walked alongside me as we learned new cultures together. And once again, I learned from them more, sometimes I thought, than they learned from me. I'm the seasoned expert, right? I know the English language inside and out. I've got too many degrees. And yet my students were the ones, the tender-hearted ones, who walked with me to adjust to a new place, being a total stranger, and we learned together. That purpose carried through. Another purpose, welcoming the stranger. I have done this in a variety of places, whether it's now as an administrator where I'm opening the pathways and creating the ability for students, adult immigrant students, to achieve new goals and to reach their dreams. I'm welcoming the stranger, but I don't know the stranger. I don't know their names. I'm an administrator in my office with spreadsheets and dollar signs. And yet, I'm still welcoming the stranger in my role. I welcomed the stranger when I lived in rural Indiana, and I worked with the one Mexican family in town who worked at a pig farm, because nobody spoke Spanish there but me. And so I taught their children English, and I helped answer their questions about the educational system. So it carries through many different situations. Listening to the unheard is another theme, purpose from my life. As I've learned about the great, deep divisiveness that stems from a broken racial history in our country, one of the things and being in an interracial marriage and family where I've been the only white person in my household for 2 decades, I've I hear a lot, and I hear a lot that most people with my skin don't always hear unless they're in my situation or walking in my shoes. And I've worked with a lot of people from different backgrounds and different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And what I have learned is everyone has a voice, but not everybody is listened to. And so one of my purposes has been, how do I make sure that that happens? Out of that, my book was accidentally born because I'm a writer, and it just came from me processing the pain of our years in Indiana, was my way of listening to the unheard and helping other people who may not know how to do that, learn how to do that. And finally, smoothing rough places. The first one that comes to mind on this one is teaching high school freshmen, because they're very rough places. If any of you have 14-year-olds or work with 14-year-olds, you will know that 14-year-olds carry a lot of rough edges, right? And so when I taught high school, when I've taught middle school, I love the age. I just don't like them 135 at a time when I'm in control or responsible for entertaining them. But I do love that stage of life, because there's a lot of rough edges that we all carry. We just learn how to smooth it, right? When I taught middle school, probably the most potent lesson I learned was that we're all middle schoolers. We've just learned how to hide it, right? And so we all have that deep down insecurity and fear. Does everybody like me? And am I okay? We just don't say it out loud anymore once we reach a certain stage. So I'd encourage you, as you look at your sense of purpose, think professionally, but also think personally and broadly about what purpose looks like in your life and thematically. Paying attention to your self-identity. This is something, too, that kind of ties into purpose. Being more than your job and having boundaries around your work. I do not work on Sundays, and I try my very best not to work on weekends. It depends on your job if that actually works or not. And yet I find to stay sane and be productive in all areas of my life, I have to have boundaries around what I do so that I have room for other things in my life. If we're overcommitted, it can mean that we're bad at everything when we take on too much. And so knowing your purpose and filtering your choices through your purposes allows you to say no to things that allows you to be good at other things. And then making time to rest, taking time off, going to bed on time, and making sure that rest is something that you're not always tired. Because when we're tired, well, if you're like me, you're grumpy. But when we're tired, we are not our best, professionally or personally. 6, cultivating relationships, both personal and professional. One thing I would say here, I think that's a key lesson from my current job that I would just pass along, and as I've been an administrator in many environments, my teachers who are reliable and accurate and reasonable are my go-tos. I love getting feedback from people, even critical feedback. It drives me crazy when teachers whine. And there's a fine line that you have to learn, because it's important that you share with your supervisors and administrators how their decisions impact your classroom. And yet there are ways that you can do it that are reliable, accurate, and reasonable. One of my teachers emailed me a research article about a hard thing we'd been dealing with, and said, I've been struggling trying to understand this. And so I went to the research to figure it out, and this is what I read, and she shared it with me and said, these are my ideas. And I went, I love you, thank you. Because again, the feedback is fabulous, but pay attention to the tone and the spirit in which you communicate that, because it makes you It cultivates positive relationships with your colleagues and with your supervisors, and it models things for people under you, for you to be a leader and professional in your context. Sharing your work generously with others, I think we do this pretty well as teachers, I think. But again, like Susan Gare, who's going to share all of her curriculum that she's writing, things like this really build relationships. People are grateful for you and come to you and look to you as a leader in professional organizations, things like this. 7, reflecting. again, knowing, understanding your successes and your failures. If you hit one of those failure times, ask why. Don't just run away from the failure. Say, what happened here? Who am I and how does this match up? Why aren't these things going together? That comes back to the grit attitude. Sometimes if we're teachers, many of us were successful in school, not all of us, so we're used to successes, and that makes failure hard. And yet, if you run into that failure, seek to understand it and reflect on why it happened. Also, make your successes known strategically. If you publish a research article, if you're doing a presentation, if you get a great letter from your student that makes you look really good, send it to somebody so that they see it. That's not bragging, that's making your successes known strategically. Be as humble as you can in the mix of it, right? But I want to know when my teachers do something great because I'm proud of them. Communicate that to your supervisors and your colleagues. Leaning into weakness, we talked about a little bit, and pursue action over talk. Be somebody, a professional, who is known for the quality of work you do over how many things you're involved in. Oh, I do this, and this, and behind the scenes, everybody's going, yeah, and she doesn't do any of it well, right? Be action-oriented and be excellent in your action. Finally, I'd encourage you to think creatively about your skills. As teachers, I wrote a blog post once, why you should hire a teacher for your next job, mostly because I was looking for a new job and didn't want to be a teacher anymore. And yet my thinking behind it was, you have a ton of skills as a teacher. And if you hit a point where you're like, this kind of classroom, whatever it is, isn't quite for me, what else could I do? Think creatively about that. Teachers, are you good at student interactions? Are you good at planning or creating, research, data analysis, strategizing, organizing, designing, communicating, problem solving, grading? Controlling is my little personal joke. My husband's a trained social worker, and I tease him that he was far better prepared for marriage than I was because they train social workers to do things like listen and be compassionate. And pretty much as teachers, we learned we're trained to boss people around and tell them what to do and control their actions, right? Like, go my way. And sometimes we can be quite good at controlling. So it has been said in my house, you're not a teacher here. Please don't act like one. But thinking about what are my favorite things to do, and then being creative and thinking about how can I translate that. If you're looking for a new setting or next steps, don't just think teacher box. There are many things that we've seen that you can do. I want to close with a Socrates quote where he says the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And if we're going to be leaders in our field, fighting anything in our day and age isn't what needs to happen. We need new things to be built because whatever from our old is broken, it's not working, and we can see that. It's my belief that English language teachers are on a great bridge for building new, because often we understand the intersection between culture and difference because we live it ourselves on a daily basis. And so when we look toward leading in our field and helping build our field and the worlds around us, whether that's our personal life or our professional context, we need to look at how do we build new things, not just, I don't like this change. It's hard for me. We need to be thinking with a resilient attitude, with some grit that says, all right, gonna take a deep breath here, and how do I build what's new for the sake of the world and the people around me? So thanks for your time.